Welcome to the Currie Family Lecture, Prominence of Place, a consideration of how place shapes Union Presbyterian Seminary. This webinar is hosted by Union Presbyterian Seminary, now offering the new Master of Arts in Public Theology degree program. Are you called to be a Christian leader in the public square? Know someone considering theological education? Contact our admissions directors at admissions@upsem.edu. Our keynote speaker is Dr. William Sweetser, Union Presbyterian Seminary historian and retired minister in the PCUSA denomination. Our moderator is Dr. Hee Chang, Associate Professor of Supervised Ministry and Director of Supervised Ministry and Vocational Planning at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Joining us from the Currie family is Reverend Dr. Chris Currie, Senior Pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Shreveport, Louisiana. Dr. Richard Boyce, Professor of Practical Theology and Academic Dean for the Charlotte campus of Union Presbyterian Seminary. And Dr. Brian Blunt, President and Professor of New Testament at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Dr. Blunt, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mike. Everyone, let me extend a warm greeting to you this evening and welcome you here to this wonderful conversation. I know it will be a wonderful presentation that you will find from Dr. Sweetser, and then Dr. Chang will lead us in an excellent conversation following. But I want to make sure that you feel right at home this evening as we gather together to think about the seminary and to think about its history and to think about place and its relationship to our theological mission and purpose. I am here with two people that who are going to be talking to you that I have the utmost regard for and appreciation for. Of course, Dr. Sweetser, who agreed many years ago now when I went to him to ask if we could have him use his gifts to do a history of the seminary all the way back to 1812 and forward. And actually, he went beyond the call of duty. He went beyond 1812 and talked about the context in which the seminary was founded and then moved forward. It was a gift for us to celebrate for our bicentennial. I'm grateful to Bill for his continuing friendship and his continuing willingness to share his knowledge with the seminary community with regard to our history. And then also here representing the Currie family, Dr. Chris Currie, who has been a wonderful friend and colleague, particularly since he has been a pastor at First Presbyterian Shreveport. I've enjoyed being able to go there and preach and teach within his congregation. And I'm certainly also thankful and very grateful to his father, Tom Currie, who was the founding dean at our Charlotte campus. I think of him as I look at Dr. Chris Currie right now on the screen. Dr. Tom Currie was a tremendous mentor and colleague for me when I first started in 2007 here at the seminary. So all of these connecting points for me that remind me of how the seminary itself has been a strong connecting point for so many of our leaders in the Presbyterian Church and in the church at large across its now 209 years of history. I'm grateful for this opportunity to welcome you, and I hope that you will find it an enriching experience this evening as we think together about the school we all love and about its meaning and purpose for us.
Yes.
So now at this time, I want to pass the baton on to Dr. Chris Currie, who's going to bring us greetings from his family. Chris.
Thank you, Brian. On behalf of the Currie family, again, my name is Chris Currie, and it's an honor to be part of this Currie Family Lecture and to say a little bit about Thomas White Currie Jr., whose gift inspired this lecture on the history and mission of the church. Thomas White Currie Jr.'s commitments echoed the themes of history and mission in his own life and work. His Ph.D. dissertation at what was then Union Theological Seminary in Virginia would later become the History of Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. His love of church history and the history of mission was not some kind of attempt to preserve and fossilize the past, but rather a love for the heroes and heroines of the faith whose risks and witness continue to inspire our own as we look to the future. When I graduated college, I had no intention of answering the call to ministry, though Thomas W. Currie Jr. more than once had encouraged me to give it serious consideration. Upon my graduation, I received a book from him, A Word in Season, Perspectives on Christian World Missions by Leslie Newbegin. For a long time, that book stayed untouched on a shelf, but in more recent years, this missional view of ministry and its perspective on world Christianity have become a crucial part of my understanding and of our larger church's understanding of what church is and what mission is. Thankfully, his love of history and the way that it serves Christ's church led Thomas W. Currie Jr. to see the future more hopefully and more clearly. That's the vision that inspired these lectures, and that is the vision that continues to guide us and shape the church for years to come. Thank you, and thanks to Richard Boyce for saying more about what is to come.
Thank you, Chris, and we're glad that your wider family's commitment to church history has borne tangible fruit in your calling to the gospel ministry and your deep friendship with Union Presbyterian Seminary. Thank you, and we thank your extended family. Our founding dean is in transit right now from Charlotte to Texas, and he's promised me he'll watch this eventually. If you'll coach him on how to track down this video, Chris, we'd appreciate that. But thank you for your family's commitment, not to fossilized history in the past, but studying history and missions in a way that not only inform the present, but might guide us into an exciting future. That's what the Currie gift to Union Presbyterian Seminary has enabled us to do through supplementing the teaching, particularly on the Charlotte campus. Dr. Sweetser and now Dr. Bird have both benefited from those monies, and providing special opportunities for education in the area of church history and missions. And that's what we're about tonight. We're in for a treat tonight as Dr. Sweetser recaps some of the history of the Richmond campus, the move from Hampton, Sydney to Richmond. We're hoping you've watched the video. If not, you can do so afterwards, but he's going to make some summary of the video contents and then some further comments. And then we'll turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Chang, who will kick off some questions. I'd urge you to pay attention to the chat function. We'll be monitoring the chat function after some preliminary questions that Dr. Sweetser has already been fed. You will have an opportunity to ask some new questions of him tonight, and we hope it will be a lively, forthright discussion. I'm deeply grateful and honored to introduce Dr. Hee Chang, my colleague in ministry and teaching here on the Charlotte campus. Hee is the perfect person to guide this conversation because of the way Hee in her teaching and in her ministry combines various worlds and perspectives. She brings to her teaching both the P.S.E.E. stream and our heritage, and now her familiarity with the Union stream. She not only now knows maybe more than she wants to know about North American Christianity, but she brings her global perspective on Christianity to all she teaches and her witness. She also is deeply interested in place and context in the intersection of various cultures. That's her passion in her teaching and in her work in supervised ministry. Context is not simply a peripheral part of ministry. Context ought to guide and determine the shape of ministry, and that's what our conversation will be about tonight. Hee, we're so grateful that you were willing to help guide this conversation. And we know with your pedagogical talents, you're going to help us talk in a constructive and productive way with one another. Thank you so much. You're muted, Sung-Hee.
Well, I guess I need to learn my pedagogical way and unmuted way first. Thank you, Richard, for having me. And I am so delighted to welcome Dr. William B. Sweetser Jr. to our annual Currie Family Lecture, and a great honor to introduce our lecturer tonight. Dr. Sweetser is not a stranger to Union. With his passion for and dedication to the early church history, he has taught on the Charlotte campus for the last 15 years. His Church History 1 course is the very first class for new students who have a diverse range of backgrounds, from those who are out of school for 30 years to those who just graduated college. As an energetic teacher and caring mentor, Dr. Sweetser creates a sense of a community and belongings in the class. He doesn't lose anyone in his class, which covers the birth of Christianity till the Reformation era in one term. Dr. Sweetser teaches with joy. I'm not just talking about his courageous laughter. He made history alive and fun while listening to his lecture. Students often feel history becomes live stories. The historical narrative not only captures facts and figures, but also makes sense and becomes real in his teaching. Many students recall Dr. Sweetser's unique pedagogy associated with his 9th century technology. When the Charlotte campus moved into the new building on Sharon Road from Queen's University, everyone was very proud of the advanced, well, except for one person, Dr. Sweetser, who liked to use whiteboards. He protested that his classroom needed nothing but a smart board. With his deep, faithful conviction on historical pedagogy, he said, "Since I taught about 9th century, I used medieval technology and whined that I needed a whiteboard. Both Dean Currie and Dean Boyce made sure that by the words of my classroom should stand whiteboards, and they are still there." As Union's faithful alumnus, Dr. Sweetser received his M.Div, Th.M, and Ph.D. from Union Presbyterian Seminary. In the past 26 years, as a Presbyterian minister, he served 2 churches in Virginia and First Presbyterian in Spruce Pine, North Carolina, until his retirement in 2018. Among his many accomplishments, as a seminary historian, Dr. Sweetser is author of the seminary's official history book titled A Copious Fountain, A History of Union Presbyterian Seminary from 1812 to 2012. This comprehensive history of Union Presbyterian Seminary gives the cultural, historical context to the school from its beginning through its bicentennial year. In Copious Fountain, combining extensive research, interviews, photographs, and primary source documents with engaging storytelling, Dr. Sweetser brings to light the enduring influence of Union Presbyterian Seminary on the church and beyond. In Copious Fountain, Dr. Sweetser concludes his narrative of history of the seminary with a statement of certainty that Union Presbyterian Seminary will continue to serve regional and national and international faith community and remain vital in the proclamation of the gospel. His certainty is perhaps more a prayer for challenging times remain ahead for theological schools. Dr. Sweetser's excellent work by showcasing the successes and failures of the past may help lead theological education into a promising future. This year's Currie Family Lecture title is Prominence of Place, a consideration of how place shapes a seminary. After the lecture, we'll have an opportunity to answer questions from the audience. Those who are participating webinar, please send us your questions. Dr. Sweetser, we are so glad that you are here and look forward to your lecture tonight.
Thank you, Sung Hee, and I want to thank the seminary community for inviting me to speak. I think it's important in this time when we have been separated and the future looks like we have to stay 6 feet apart, that we, in our history, think about how the seminary can bring us together. And I appreciate the Currie family for all they have done, especially for Tom Currie. He's the one who asked me to come and teach and in Charlotte. And for my entire ministry, I've been associated with Union Seminary. And I just love both campuses. So thank you for allowing me to speak on a subject that's near and dear to my heart. When Tim first asked me to speak on this subject, I thought that Walter W. Moore had some insights that we could pay attention to in our time. He articulated 3 reasons why the seminary should move from Hampton, Sydney in Central Virginia to Richmond. And they are not just reasons that have to do with the physical location of the seminary. Rather, I think it teaches us, or his thoughts teach us, that there are many more dimensions to space than just buildings. The first reason why Walter W. Moore thought we should move the seminary from Hampton, Sydney to Richmond was one of isolation. In 1883, Frederick Jackson Turner stood before the Chicago World's Fair and declared that the frontier had disappeared. As a consequence, the United States was now an urban instead of a rural country. Frederick Jackson Turner was concerned that becoming an urban country would decrease the democratic dynamism of American society, that the American individual and self-reliance would disappear. In contrast, Walter W. Moore felt optimistic about the change from a rural to an urban society. He saw new opportunities for the church. But these opportunities could only be realized if union moved. Railroads dominated life in the 19th century the way interstates dominate our landscape. And it's really hard for us to imagine how important railroads were. In 1865, the United States had 35,000 miles of track. In 1880, 93,000. And by 1916, there were 254,000 miles of track. It's been said that no town in America was more than 30 minutes away from a railroad. As a consequence, in the last third of the 19th century, Southern Baptist Seminary was located in Greenville, South Carolina. They moved to Louisville, Kentucky. Southwestern moved from Waco, Texas to Fort Worth. Northern Baptist moved Morgan Park Seminary to Chicago, and the Methodists moved to Evanston from Boston. There was, however, no direct connection to anywhere from Hampton, Sydney. For example, if you wanted to go to Hampton, Sydney from West Virginia, it would take a day. From Charlotte, Raleigh, or Greensboro, it could take overnight. And from Wilmington or Fayetteville, it could take 2 days because of the way the trains ran. But once you got to Farmville, it was 1 to 2 hours to go over the dirt road in good weather. In bad weather, it could take 4 hours. And the red mud was so overwhelming that its nickname was the Red Sea. Telephones arrived only in 1884 at Hampton, Sydney, electricity 1892, and the college, but not the seminary, had indoor plumbing by 1895. Union was isolated. And the way to, I guess you could say, the way to solve that problem of isolation was to move the seminary to a large city with good railroad connections. Yet the other aspect is, besides isolation, was one of physical plant. There was a petition signed by 19 students, including Joseph Anderson Vance, a future moderator of the Northern Church, protesting the shortage of water during the fall months. The only way for students to get water was to drink from cisterns, which had to be large enough to supply the seminary. In the winter, it was no problem because it would snow, but in the summer, it would not snow so much. And as you got down to the bottom of the cistern, the students complained that there were all kinds of bugs and plants and other unmentionable items. Moore also realized that student housing was a problem. There was no central heat. If you wanted to use what was delicately called the facilities, you had to go outside. There was no indoor plumbing. Dormitory and classrooms were heated with fireplaces and wood stoves, and students were expected to split their own wood from a huge wood pile behind the seminary and lug their logs up to their rooms. And there had to be extra wood cutting on Saturday because no wood chopping was allowed on the Sabbath. As Walter W. Moore said, the church cannot afford to ignore the concentration of modern life and influence in the cities. Walter W. Moore saw seminary education in a new way, not as a monastery where you go to escape from the world, but rather as a place you go to learn how to engage the world in a Christian way. So besides the obvious issues of isolation and physical plant, there was also the need for the professionalization of the ministry. By moving, Moore was not just suggesting a different location. Rather, he was also proposing that we look at theological education in a completely different light. Now, Union's rural location resulted in the lack of opportunities for practical education, and Moore thought this was the foundation of a theological education in the modern age. He pointed out that just as tutors and law colleges gave way to seminaries, isolated seminaries producing ministers for a rural society now had to give way to urban seminaries educating professionals in a fast-changing, mobile, and diverse culture. Moore was always blunt and firm on this point, and he was always adamant. He insisted that fieldwork education, be it teaching Sunday school or filling a pulpit at a rural church or an urban church, be part of every student's seminary training. He pointed out there was no possibility of large-scale fieldwork in Southside Virginia because there just weren't enough churches. Ultimately, Moore saw theological education in a new way. In addition to the traditional academic subjects, he saw fieldwork, be it Sunday school training, preaching classes, or going out into the community as a vital part of seminary education. Moore wanted to not only transform how seminary education was delivered, but by looking at a different place for that seminary education, he wanted to see a new kind of church engaging a new kind of world. Perhaps the best way I can illustrate this is that Moore always wanted to be at the forefront of technological change. He understood that the institution of rural free delivery meant that Union Seminary could publish a magazine and distribute it all over the country. So with the advent of rural free delivery in the 1890s, Union Seminary became nationally known because they were one of the first seminaries to publish a magazine. Along with this was what you could say the law of unintended consequences. The minute students got to Richmond, they saw a whole panoply of missions which the old Southern Church, the PCUS, had not intended. Churches went into the African American sections, they went to working class people, they went into prisons, they held Bible studies on tugboats, they helped African Americans in a Jim Crow segregated society begin to start their own churches and institutions. And it was from this that Union became known as a leader, sometimes much to the Southern Church's discomfort, in engaging the New South. I would also like to suggest, along with professionalization of the ministry, that Walter W. Moore required that before the seminary could be open, there had to be one student housing that was the best of the day. And initially, before electricity, it was to be every floor, every room was to be lighted with gas. There was also to be indoor plumbing, which sounds strange to us, but for the students of the time, they were thrilled to be able to take a bath inside, to have running water. The other issue was that Walter W. Moore felt very strongly that the seminary was not the church, but a servant of the church. And he initiated Schaffler Hall, which was meant to be a demonstration church and a demonstration Sunday school, so that students on campus could learn how to learn their trade and then go out into the world and confront a modern society that was different and different than anyone had ever known, yet they were prepared for the future. By moving to Richmond, Walter W. Moore not only changed the place of theological education, he changed how we think about theological education and what it was meant to do. These remarks are meant to go along with the video that I hope everyone has seen. And that is the end of my remarks that hopefully will give everyone a deeper understanding of what you saw in the video. And I invite everyone to ask questions.
For such a powerful lecture and insightful reflection to trace Union Presbyterian Seminary past 200 years in such a short time. We want to move to some questions and answers. If folks watching this webinar might have questions, please send your questions. Dr. Sweetser, you mentioned in designing a transformation in this video. Can you please elaborate more on 1898, the 1890s, the significant change of place? Was there any on-campus opposition to moving the seminary from Hampton, Sydney, and Farmville, Virginia, to the city of Richmond?
No, there's absolutely no on-campus opposition. The primary opposition to moving came from churchmen in rural Virginia. Walter W. Moore was from North Carolina. He knew people in North Carolina at the Presbyterian, the Synod. And when the question was presented to the Synod of North Carolina, there was absolute agreement that the seminary should move. North Carolinians sought in their best interest that Union be more accessible. led by the president of Hampton, Sydney. He demanded several meetings to try to convince people that moving to Richmond was going to be a horrible idea. There were several stories in the Farmville paper about how moving to Richmond would sissify the ministers who were graduating, so they wouldn't be able to endure the hardships of rural ministry. The vote was 2/3 in favor of moving to Richmond in the Virginia Synod. So they moved, and I think the best thing the best story I can tell is a student wrote in the student newspaper that he was mad when he first got to Richmond because the first thing he did was spend a quarter on a bath. And then he got to Union and found out he had wasted his quarter because there were bathtubs on every floor.
Well, in your masterful research on history of seminaries' evolution over 200 centuries, are there any key evidence that the seminary advocated for religious and social reform? In particular, is there any evidence that the seminary resisted urban renewal in the late 1960s?
Is there any evidence that seminary resisted urban renewal in the late 1960s? To be honest, I think the seminary embraced urban renewal. The Advance campaign called for a wholesale change of the campus. In fact, there were buildings that were going to be knocked down, and they were going to be put up in what I call the late 1960s spaceship modernist style of round buildings. And the vision was for the seminary to be modern. I would say that, to be honest, the seminary probably embraced urban renewal only because they saw that the seminary would be swept along with it. Inflation in the late 1960s really doomed the Advance fundraising campaign. So the Advance apartments were built, but the quadrangle was never touched.
Thank you. The next question is that toward the end of your video that we showed, you mentioned how much has changed and how much has stayed the same. With all the changes, the all physical spaces of the seminary over the years, what has stayed the same? What has endured? How does that sameness shape us today? And how should it best shape us into the future?
Bill is having some audio problems, Sung Hee, and while he goes in and out, I'd be happy to elaborate a little bit. I've read that book over and over again. I read when he was in initial draft periods, and then have read it several times since. So I can begin to answer that question. He can do it much better, of course. But how has it remained the same, and how has it changed? And some of the ways in which it has changed dramatically have been, I think, along the lines of issues of race. Well, there is Bill. Can you hear us now, Bill?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'll slip back out because you can answer these questions better than I can.
Okay. Thank you.
I am grateful, President Blunt and Dr. Sweetser. The question is that toward the end of the video, you mentioned how much has changed and how much has stayed the same. And how has the stayed same and that endured, and how does that sameness shape us today, and how should it best shape us into the future?
That's a good question. Having been on both campuses, one of the things that strikes me is the sense of community. I know that a lot of educational institutions stress community. I know a lot of educational institutions want to talk about the uniqueness of their community. But what strikes me about Union is that by having the same campus in place, having the same kind of curriculum, and all working towards the goal of ministry, I think makes I will say the community the same now as it has been. I've often thought that if a student from 1898 walked on campus now, the only changes he would see would be the fact that there are no horses, and Schauffler Hall, which wasn't built until the 1920s, is there. But the mission would still be the same, and the classes would be recognizable to any student. In fact, since 1812, the curriculum would be recognizable, and what we learn would be recognizable. Now, how we learn it would be different, but it would be recognizable. So that is the sameness. And I don't view that as being stuck in amber. I don't view that as being in any way constrained. Rather, we could be creative within our tradition. That's what keeps us new. It's the tradition that remains.
Thank you. Dr. James Tenetti asks, how did two Presbyterian schools as ATS and UTS find themselves on two sides of the road? How has that shaped each in their initial encounter?
That's another good question. I forget the woman's name, but there in the early 1900s, there was a real drive for women to assist missionaries. It was felt that women did have I will say, a function on the mission field. And there was a woman who attended Union, and she took all the classes, and they did not want to give her a degree because she was a woman. Walter Moore thought the church was being short-sighted and recommended to the General Assembly that a training school be established for women to go out and assist missionaries. When Union was established on now what is the quadrangle, on the other side of the street, Moore's vision was to have Hampton, Sydney move to the Westwood tract, so there would be a college and then a seminary. Hampton, Sydney always resisted that. So when the General Assembly wanted to establish ATS, there was land already available, and the seminary gave it to start ATS.
Thank you. Dr. Brian Blunt asks, what great change from Dabney to Lingle and E.T. Thompson was one that was key for the future of the seminary and the Southern Presbyterian Church, don't you think?
Oh, yes. The interesting thing about Dabney is that when people mention Dabney, they think of Union. And Dabney, I think, ended up as a bitter man who was stuck in the past. He was buried in his Confederate uniform. And the minute that Walter Moore arrived on campus, it was clear that Dabney was not going to be able to stay because Moore, in Dabney's eyes, was way too progressive. When Dabney left, unfortunately, his Defense of Virginia, written right after the war, was influential, and his influence remained. Yet, Benjamin Morton Smith was instrumental in establishing a Reconstruction school system for Virginia, which included all children regardless of race. And his influence was very, was diminished by Dabney. I'll put it to you that way. And E.T. Thompson, through two articles he wrote in the Presbyterian Outlook in 1948, really challenged Dabney's thinking as reflected in the church that the Bible mandated slavery and segregation, and his two articles and his continual speaking changed the church's mind. And that is something Union can be proud of, because Union found itself assaulted from many sides at times, yet they continually backed E.T. Thompson, and he continually called for change.
Jennifer Smith asked, the public schools in Farmville closed rather than integrating. What would have happened at Union during the time of massive resistance if it had stayed at H5 rather than moved to Richmond?
Yes, it's ironic that when B.M. Smith started or designed the schools for the Commonwealth of Virginia, he was the superintendent of Prince Edward County schools, and they were always seen as being ahead of the rest of Virginia. And then when Brown versus Board of Education comes up, this Commonwealth of Virginia closed their public schools and rather than admit blacks. So what happens in Farmville, it becomes the center of massive resistance, and it catches Hampton Sydney in a real bind. Benjamin Rice Lacy, who had just stopped serving as the president of Union, led the opposition to massive resistance. So I tend to think that if the seminary had stayed in Hampton Sydney rather than moving to Richmond, that they would have been in the forefront of fighting massive resistance. But that's just a feeling I have, because I think by the time Walter W. Moore wanted to move, I'll say this, that the seminary had grown beyond many of the attitudes of Southside Virginia.
It's great. As you developed in your book, the 5 themes that you have guided the core curriculum through 200 years. Would you tell us what are the themes and would be still critical in future theological education at Union? It's kind of a twofold, and I'd like to ask you to, according to your teaching experience at Union, what would you add as a core values or theme to our current seminary's mission?
The 5 primary, I'll say, curricular subjects required in the Presbyterian Seminary were developed by John Knox during his time in Geneva. Old Testament, New Testament, church history, polity, and preaching and worship. I have to say that in my experience in seminary, both as a student and teacher, that I think it would be foundational for the seminary to continue to stress pastoral education. I think that the church in the modern world is in a much different area, much different frame of mind than it was 200 years ago. And I think in the 1950s, Union was in the forefront of clinical pastoral education. And I think I would keep that emphasis. I'm not sure I would add that, but I would certainly keep it. I think that it's important that Union be in the forefront of that, because the church has many more functions to fill in society than just preaching and teaching. And I think care of souls involves clinical pastoral education.
Thank you. Rodney Sadler. Dr. Sadler asks, what was the role of Union faculty and students during the civil rights movement? How did the role change from the attitude of Dabney?
Well, I'm going to tell the story on Dr. Sadler. We were at Hampton Sydney one time, and he went out to the graveyard to catch the breeze from Dabney turning in his grave. And I think that just about defines what what Dabney would have thought. I think Dabney was against the move to Richmond. And from Texas, he wrote letter after letter and broadside after broadside against the move. Because the minute Union moves to Richmond, they begin to minister to the African American community. And I think the logical outcome of this is students being involved in the civil rights movement. Lingle, Walter L. Lingle introduced the Southern Church of the Social Gospel. And over a generation, students realized that there was something wrong in our country. And so students became involved in the civil rights movement. They marched downtown when Tallheimers and Miller and Rhodes were integrating. And this is not to say this was completely supported by every student on campus or every faculty member. I will say, and I think I can say that if the seminary was not united behind the civil rights movement, even those who questioned the civil rights movement understood the need to change. And I view that as I'll say a victory for Walter Lingle and for the students who, when they first got to Richmond, engaged in ministries that the PCUS would never have approved. And how did the role change from the attitudes of Dabney? To be honest, I think once the seminary moved to Richmond, the mindset of Dabney was discarded completely.
Great. You mentioned law of unintended consequences in the video. In what ways might the law of unintended consequences still be shaping the seminary today?
Oh my. I think I would answer this question differently a year ago. I think the pandemic has separated people, and whereas when I retired, people were talking about colleges without walls and church online and doing everything online, the people I speak with and my own personal feelings is that we have lost community. We have lost something when we can't be around other people. So I think the future is going to be technological like this, but I think there's a real hunger in people's souls to be in a physical community near people. So the law of unintended consequences, I think, was over a year ago, we were thinking about more technology. Now we're planning on more ways to get people together.
Well, in your earlier lecture, you mentioned about the seminary has a history of using new technologies in practical ways to shape local congregations' lives of faith and to share the latest innovations and developments in the theological teaching and method. What were some of the most successful of those efforts to shape and share in the past? And what might be some ways that seminary should help shape and generously share with the congregations and broader community today?
Up until the 1960s, every student in their second and third year was assigned a church. And if they had to go to the Shenandoah Valley, they would get a free train ticket on the trailways to go and serve the church. That's the reason why nothing happens in the seminary on Monday morning, because students were getting back. They were returning from their churches. That ended in the 70s. The reasons really aren't clear to me. But I think one of the ways the church needs to connect with the seminary is to have students more involved in the church. For example, I was never assigned to church. I would take preaching opportunities to go out to preach at churches, but I was never involved in the life of a church that I was assigned. Now, I belonged to 3-Chopped. I was involved with them, but I think the seminary misses something and the church misses something when students are not a constant presence.
Thank you. Mark Thomas asks, the PCUS, the Board of Christian Education, was located in Richmond. What was the relationship with the seminary?
That's a great question. I think officially the relationship was one of professionalism and distance. Because of their location, I think the Board of Christian Education really had a partnership with PSCE and Union. And I say that because there were several members on the Board of Christian Education and people who worked in Richmond who got together with E.T. Thompson and others to really start shaping the Sunday school curriculum to challenge some of the prevailing notions in the wider Southern culture. I know a lot of people in PSCE worked on curriculum development with the board, and so there was a real symbiotic relationship, but it was always kind of under the table. It was always walk across the street, we'll have lunch, because when E.T. Thompson was accused of heresy, there really needed to be a professional attitude, but E.T. still continued to write Sunday school curriculum.
Well, my next question is that if spaces shape us, what was the intended shape of the leaders of the seminary hoped would be formed through the spaces of Union's Richmond campus particularly?
That's a good question, too. That kind of involves us looking into the mind of Walter W. Moore. And the only thing I can think of is that both the Southern Church specifically, by the 1920s, begins to adopt the idea of minister as CEO. And what happens? You have the idea that ministers start off in small churches and they work their way up to big churches, and then they'll serve on the General Assembly committee. So the idea, to be honest, I think, is that a minister becomes an executive so he could speak to other executives. And I think that by the 1960s, that model becomes outmoded. And I think we're still struggling with that today.
I trace back, Dr. Richard Boyce asks, he loves the theme of unintended consequences again. Are the unintended consequences of Union's location in Ginter Park different today than they were in the past?
I'm not so sure. Now, I cannot prove this, but I think that Walter W. Moore wanted to move to Charlotte, specifically the area around Davidson. Louis Ginter had started a development which was really not doing very well, and he was in business with George Watts. And in the great practices of the Gilded Age, they worked a business deal, and George W. Watts announced that the seminary was going to move to Richmond because they were getting free land. This land was in Ginter Park. And I'm not sure Moore was exactly ecstatic about it, but he finally thought it was a good idea. The seminary moves to Richmond, and basically Richmond is thrilled. The community is welcoming. Richmond never really recovered from the Civil War. It had fewer, its population was less in 1900 than it was in 1860. It was a poor town. And the seminary moving to Richmond gave him imprimatur to Richmond, which was very much appreciated. At the same time, the minute the seminary announces they are moving to Ginter Park, sales of land in Ginter Park skyrocket. So I think unintended consequences is that the seminary moved because of a land deal. I won't say it's shady, but it certainly is not transparent. And they continued to influence Ginter Park to be a upper middle class neighborhood. And I would say that today the seminary probably has less influence, only because the church in America has less influence.
You kind of already touched, but Mike Frontiero asks, how was the seminary received by its new Richmond community after the move?
Okay. The day that the seminary opened, thousands of people were there. And if you read in the student newspaper, stores around Ginter Park were offering student discounts on clothes and everything else. The streetcar lines were adding extra cars. So I would say that Richmond was absolutely thrilled to have the seminary in their town. By the mid-1920s, however, as students go out and actively challenge the social structure, you begin to have editorials about why doesn't Ben Rice Lacy keep those students where they belong? So in the beginning, I think Richmond was thrilled. By the 1920s, 1930s, maybe not so much, but Richmond has always seen the seminary as a great resource.
Thank you. Dr. Sadler asks again that appreciates the notion that space shapes mission as well. And how does the inward-facing orientation of the seminary buildings impact its relationship to the larger community and world?
That question goes back to the first site plan. Walter W. Moore wanted a seminary that would the buildings would face inward. The architect took for his inspiration the University of Virginia. But at the same time that the seminary buildings face inward, if you notice, there are no big buildings with long continuous walkways. And this was to symbolize that as students come out of the buildings, although the orientation may be inward, ministry is to go outside. And Walter W. Moore did not want any big buildings, any imposing edifices that would keep people out. Yet he also wanted the students to understand that they were in a community, but that community was to spread out into the world.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sweetser, for joining us today. And I want to thank everyone who participated in the conversation by sending questions. And I turn it over to Dr. Boyce for other announcements.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sweetser and Dr. Chang. What a dynamic duo y'all are, and how well, Dr. Chang, you wove in the questions from the wider audience. And Bill, I'm impressed by the way you endured audio problems and still managed to hang in there. And I'm even more impressed that our president just jumped into the gap there. I was really going to be interested in how Brian finished out that question. Thank y'all for this lively discussion that's reminding us of the way place affects our mission and our outreach and the shape of this seminary. I continue, Bill, I've heard Brian light up talking about W.W. Moore. And I guess, Brian, part of that is once someone's foolish enough to step into an administrative type position, you realize how hard change is. And to read these stories of W.W. Moore standing up to Dabney, moving out of Farmville, finding a new location, doing innovative things on the campus, new publications, a practice, Sunday school and church. I'm humbled, Bill, by the heritage we have, and it sort of puts us in our place about whining as we come out of this pandemic. We're facing a lot of change right now, but we have faced change in the past, and we have turned that change in a transformative way for the sake of the church in the world. Thank you for the way you continue to make the history of this particular seminary come alive and challenge us for the future. Just two quick things. I'm very excited to share on this public forum the fact that the trustees of Union Presbyterian Seminary at their last meeting have opened a search for a church history professor to be located on the Charlotte campus, but to teach for the entire seminary. Bill, I hope you and the Currie family see this as validation of the work you have done thus far in the journey of this extension campus in Charlotte and Union Presbyterian Seminary as one seminary. We've been working for a long time toward this, and now the funds are in hand and a search will begin soon. So that's the first announcement I wanted to share. The second announcement is we've already begun to compile a video similar to this video talking about the 20-year, believe it or not, 2022 is 20 years of the Charlotte Extension campus history. And Bill has already recorded some thoughts. I've had a chance to add some thoughts, and Lisa McLennan has added some thoughts about how the place has shaped the work of Union Seminary through an extension campus in Charlotte. So stay tuned, first for the video, and then sometime in the next year, a celebration of the Charlotte campus and a similar discussion about the way place will continue to shape Union Presbyterian Seminary, Charlotte and Richmond as we move forward into God's future. So thank you, Bill, and we look forward to bringing you back. And Dr. Chang, I don't know how we're going to find a better guide than we found in you tonight. So thank you for y'all's lively discussion and the way it seeded thoughts for us all. Brian, I'll turn back to you if you want to say more about W.W. Moore, but I continue to give thanksgiving for the way you and we mine our past history for the sake of the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I want to also thank Dr. Chang and Dr. Sweetser for a wonderful, enlightening conversation. I always enjoy, Bill, I think you know, I always enjoy hearing you talk about the seminary, your passion for that research and the work that you've done. It is just a tremendous gift for this community. Thank you for your continuing willingness to share your knowledge, because I mean, you did a tremendous amount of research and that always comes across. Thank you for all that you continue to do.
You're welcome.
I also want to be thankful to the Currie family and their assistance, as Dean Boyce has said, for the Currie family history position, that search that's open now. We're looking forward to that search process and the person who will be joining us July 1 of next year, 2022. So we're eager for that process to work itself out. I want to thank all of you for joining with us tonight, and I hope it's been enlightening for you. I have enjoyed using that book as research. I hope you'll pick up a copy if you don't have one. I think you'll find an illuminating history of the seminary that will make you, I think, really proud to be a part of this community, to see where it's come from, where it has now found itself, the transitions, the passion for ministry, the love of God that has made itself concrete in some wonderfully vital ways. That book helps chronicle that for you to be able to see. And now, as we prepare to leave tonight, I've been asked if I would do the closing prayer. I'm grateful to be asked to do that. Let us bow our heads as we begin to journey for the close of our day. Gracious God, we are thankful for the gift of Reverend Dr. Bill Sweetser, for the passion of his study, for the way in which his work illumines the history of this seminary, as he looks at both the difficult moments and the joyous celebratory moments, as he looks with honesty and truth, and as he looks with joy and celebration. We give thanks for work of transparency into history, transparency into faith, transparency into hope for newness as we continue to try to live into the calling that has been a powerful part of the existence of this community for now 209 years. Guide us as we go forward into this evening. May we all journey in ways that find your peace and your thanksgiving a part of our prayer lives for this evening. And may we feel your peace and your comfort as we go our way separately in this virtual way this night. Guide and sustain us in the name of your Son, Christ Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Wednesday, May 26th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time for Wrestling with Race, Stories for African Anti-Racists from the South African Struggle with Dr. Alan Bosick. Until then, enjoy the rest of your day.